For more on the Johannesburg inner city housing crisis, we're now joined by Jodi Allemeier, an independent municipal governance and urban development consultant. Jodi, appreciate your time this evening. The conversation obviously will touch on urbanization in South Africa, legacy of colonialism and apartheid, displacement and spatial marginalization. So much to talk about regarding what's transpired in the last couple of days. But how can cities like Johannesburg address the urgent need for safe and affordable housing for their growing populations?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Hugo. And I think, we're prompted to ask this question because of the tragedy that occurred. But a few weeks ago, we were speaking about another severe incident with the Bree Street explosion. And I think in a few weeks' time, we'll be prompted to have another conversation because we do seem to be in a moment of time in Johannesburg in particular where we're sort of jumping from disaster to disaster and crisis to crisis. And so we can kind of have these political statements that say we're going to put committees together and we're going to have, reviews and all of these sorts of things. But these are not new issues that we're grappling with. We're actually now at a point in time where it's just become a very severe crisis. So the question that you ask is about, how do cities in general approach population growth and urban development and housing provision? And that's one part of it. But for a city like Joburg, the answer is no longer just about how do we provide housing in a sort of a normal population growth and economic and governance environment, because Joburg is no longer in a normal state. Joburg is now in a state of crisis, a crisis of governance, a crisis of leadership, a crisis on the ground in terms of the quality of public life, quality of public realm, the state of risk, severe risk to life that is facing people. And so our solutions need to be something different than what might have been part of the political policy and public dialogue around housing in the past. And so I do think
Jodi, sorry to come in there. You talk about solutions to the problems that we've, I'd like to believe, have basically created for ourselves because the necessary work has not been done. I mean, when we talk about you're an urban planner or a development consultant, let's do an analysis of what should have been done in the last 30 years by the city of Johannesburg authorities in order to accommodate this growing influx of people, firstly, and provision of housing as a first instance.
Yeah. If we're focusing on the inner city in particular, there was a window of opportunity that Joburg had to convert B-grade buildings into affordable housing. And that window of opportunity was known. They created the Joburg Development Agency 22 years ago with a mandate to develop Joburg. Josh Co, which is a social housing agency, is 18 years old. There were a number of efforts to establish improvement districts to manage the public realm. And so, going back 18, 20, 25 years ago, this sort of window of opportunity around the state of the inner city at that point in time, the growing population, the mechanisms that existed at that point for social housing was recognized, and agencies and institutions were created to respond to that. In some cases, they did do initiatives and did do development. Unfortunately, it wasn't fast enough, it wasn't rapid enough, and we did have then a period of time where there was governance failure, where there was a vacuum of keeping up the national subsidy regimes and changing the national subsidy regimes in line with how costs were increased on the ground is one part of it. But another part of it was really just about the attention of leadership to keeping up daily service delivery, law and order on the ground, and also preventing the hijacking of buildings and implementing the bylaw around public problem buildings in the city of Joburg. So these agencies didn't have the necessary partnership and support that they required from the state, the levers and the arm that the state kind of only has. And so that kind of window of opportunity was lost. And in its absence, in the vacuum of that, while leaders were busy with other priorities, people informally created their own solutions, which is what we're seeing now.
Now, the President has said that he's instructed his administration to identify laws that can be removed in order to make reclaiming of buildings simpler. What are some of these laws, Jodi?
So, look, there are a number of mechanisms that already exist. The problem building bylaw is something that exists. It's been used very successfully in Cape Town to, it's used routinely. There's not like once you get rid of all the problem buildings, it's gone forever. You have to consistently implement this bylaw. And it exists, the bylaw exists in Joburg. I see eThekwini's bylaw is out for review at the moment for public comment. It needs a team of people that's actually implementing it. The problem there isn't the law. The problem is that they don't have a team that's actually implementing it, a high-capacity resource team implementing it. I think some of the others that the President is referring to is around evictions and the right of people to object to evictions and to receive adequate housing in replace from that. That's a very complicated one because people, by our very nature, occupy space. We are physical beings, we take up space, and we have a right in our constitution to shelter. So there should be a process of enumeration, who is in the buildings currently, which ones of them qualify for what types of housing in our housing regime. Is it social housing? Is it B&G housing? Is it another type of shelter that can be provided? If they don't qualify for any type of that, what is the gap? How do they get supported to find alternative accommodation? But I think there probably is some work to be done to say what is the reality of the ground versus what is the aspiration of the law, and how do we make sure that we don't use the aspiration of the law to completely freeze the reality of the ground, which is not an ideal housing situation. So there are also a number.
Please carry on, Jodi.
There are a number of issues with our national housing grant process. Our grants are structured to deliver housing in a very particular way. But, I get a bit frustrated with the President saying we'll review these, because these are things that municipalities themselves have been asking the national government to review, the national grants subsidy structure and the social housing subsidy structure for more than a decade. So they don't need to be prompted by a crisis like this to review it. They know what the changes are that need to be made to allow for much more combination of housing typologies, housing modes, cross-subsidization with market housing and government-subsidized housing. These are known issues, known models that could replace them, and then constraints in the way the Act is written and the way the grants are structured. So no kind of new work needs to be done to discover these issues. It's, to me, we can sit here and say we can wait for national government to solve this problem. I think much more realistic is going to be some sort of solution where private property owners come together with social housing companies and other innovative housing forms, pool their land and resources together in the Joburg CBD and find ways on a sort of a precinct or multi-block scale to pool resources and pool subsidies. If we wait for national government to change, we've been waiting for 10 or 15 years for them to change already.
So, Jodi, our focus today is in Johannesburg, because that's where the crisis that we are discussing is at the moment. You talked about the Bree Street explosion a few weeks ago, and obviously this unfortunate incident with that fire where 74 people lost their lives, very sadly. Is Joburg any different to any other metropolitan city in South Africa? Are other cities in the country facing similar problems? And if so, how are they dealing with them? Or is this all about Johannesburg?
So every metro in South Africa has a few things that are in common. The one is definitely that, if you look at global cities, population growth is something that can be absorbed by a global city if there is also economic growth. South African metros are really struggling to provide for adequate services and adequate housing for our population as it grows, because we do not have adequate economic growth. And that is true for almost all metros. It was true for Cape Town up until quite recently. It's kind of diverted and shown a different way from the rest of the economies, metro economies. But without economic growth, we had a baseline of high unemployment, and it's increasing. So That is a fundamental issue. It has to be part of the discussion and part of any analysis of what's going on. And it's true for all metros, is that the lack of economic growth with population growth is a real constraint. The ability to provide for any services, housing, and for the market to provide for housing for people. It's very difficult for the market to house unemployed people. So that leads to informality. The nature of the informality looks different in different metros. In some, it is much more informal settlements, larger informal settlements, smaller informal settlements based on what land is available, based on proximity to work opportunities, that sort of thing. In others, like to some extent in Durban, but to the greatest extent in Johannesburg in the city, it has taken place inside established buildings. And that is a unique and more complex challenge to deal with. Now, they have different complexities to informal settlements. Johannesburg CBD and Alexandra Township are the two highest density population areas in Joburg. You compare the one has very tall buildings and the other has single residential and informal settlement. They're the highest population densities. They both have forms of informality, but they've taken shape in very different ways. They have different structures of power in terms of who is informally owning and renting the access to opportunities to be there. So in informal settlements in some metros, that is less of a sort of a issue where there's gangs and extortion. In others, it's a much stronger issue. In buildings, it's very clearly run by illegal forces, by criminal forces. And so that adds another layer to how you engage, how you get involved with any of the residents, because there is a power dynamic and a criminal element that's now also present.
Jodi, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us